My name is Cathy Levine. I'm 75 years old. I live in Bexley, Ohio, outside of Columbus, and I was born in Flushing, Queens, New York. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish community on the North Shore of Long Island. My parents were fairly progressive. My first memory of television was watching the Army McCarthy hearings, and I knew that my father was very nervous during the McCarthy era. I was brought up to view my purpose in life to repair the world, or to be an activist and fight injustice. And that's the way I saw things. I mean, it's the lens in which I viewed things. My mother wanted to take me on the March on Washington in 1963, but it was the day before my 14th birthday, and my father said no because she's too young. They said no one under 14 should go. So, my mother and aunt came home with big signs. I still have a pin from that march. And, my mother took me on my first anti-war march against the war in Vietnam in 1965. So I grew up skeptical of the U.S. government, and the more I learned, the more I didn't believe what politicians said. I went off to, so that's my upbringing. There's a lot more detail to that. I'm like writing a memoir so that my kids know something about my childhood and how I turned out the way I was. Whatever that is. So then I went off to, I was a fairly immature kid. In high school, I was an activist. I wrote editorials against the war in Vietnam in our student newspaper. And I was involved in a Students for Peace in Vietnam group in high school. But personally, very socially immature, and had a lot of insecurity and wasn't sure where to go to college. I ended up going to Case Western Reserve looking for an SDS chapter. And I found it. And there was an SDS chapter in Cleveland. That's a whole other story. But to make a long story short, I got immediately involved in the Cleveland SDS group. And by the end of my second year of college, 1969, I had decided to drop out to be a revolutionary. But not without studying for my exams, taking my exams, so I had a good transcript in case I changed my mind, because my mother always taught me not to burn my bridges. I went into a weather collective, and I was in a weatherman collective. I kind of flunked out at the end of the summer. I mean, it was the summer of 69. That was the summer that the women leadership started getting very angry at the sexism in the organization and started speaking up. And a group of us were told we were going to have to go through some kind of retraining or something. I don't know. And a friend of mine from Cleveland said to me, "Why don't you go home and think about this?" And so I went home, didn't go back, got a job in the city, and immediately knew I had to go back to school. So I went back to school in the spring of 1970, and that's when all the schools went on strike after the Kent shootings and the Orange State shootings. So I finished college, and my father was saying, go to law school or be a stenographer taking shorthand. I knew, and I didn't want to go to law school, and being a stenographer was never. So in order to avoid law school, I went off to Cambridge to follow a guy I had met in school. And several things happened. So that was spring, summer of 72. I ended up enrolling in a feminist studies program at Goddard Cambridge College, external degree program of Goddard College in Vermont. And at some point at the Women's Center in Cambridge, I met Marion Layton. And so I was simultaneously doing this feminist studies program, which is it was a seminar group, a wonderful group of women, a little diverse in terms of different branches of feminism and where we were at on the feminist development. I mean, this was, after all, 72. So, we read a lot of the basics. We floated a lot of ideas. It was just a lot of learning. And this really spoke to me because I had a pretty authoritarian father in his own little way, who parenthetically hid books in the attic that my mother and I found after his death. He had been in a Marxist-Leninist study group, but he would never tell me if he had ever joined the Communist Party. My liberal community of Great Neck, like a bunch of Great Neck Jews and lots of New York Jews, joined the Communist Party and left at different times, which is why he was so nervous during the McCarthy era. But we had very little serious political conversation because my father and I fought so much. So I never knew what that meant. Anyway, so during the time that I was really exploring feminism and what it meant in my life and getting my own voice, I met Marion, and she was involved in Rounder Records. And if you look up Rounder Records, they are an amazing independent label. They were just starting at that time. They recorded bluegrass and old-timey and folk music that other people wouldn't record. And they put out wonderful records, and the music was great. And they were 2 men and a woman, and I sort of completed I made 4. And Marion and I kicked around anarcho-feminism and wrote this paper together. And we were involved in an anarchist group, a study group. We went to visit Murray Bookchin in New York or Massachusetts. I remember going for a weekend, and, anarchism was very attractive to me as a remedy for the hierarchies that I had seen replicating themselves all over. I don't remember how I moved away from anarchism. I moved away from the Rounder folks. I moved on. I was trying desperately to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? My father offered me law school. I was really interested in healthcare. I thought about going to nursing school. And a friend of mine who had been a hospital administrator, she was in my feminist seminar. She said, you could never be a nurse. You would hate having doctors telling you what to do. Medicine is too hierarchical. Nobody suggested to me I should look into health policy but anyway. So I gave up and went to law school. And because I couldn't get into the law, I was waitlisted at the law school Northeastern, where all the activists were. I went to New England School of Law, which was one of the cheap ones. I wasn't going to pay. I applied and got into some, quote unquote, more prestigious law schools, but did not want to go there. So I went to law school. During law school, was very involved in the National Lawyers Guild. And, on issues of the day like grand jury abuse, and other issues that were, coming up during the day. I didn't find, when I finished law school, I and another woman moved from Boston, Cambridge, down to New Bedford, Massachusetts, to join an organization that was based in New Bedford and Fall River. And that organization was very small, had people working in unions to build, movements for change within the unions, like Teamsters for a Democratic Union type stuff. But they were mostly in the clothing workers unions. And I got very involved in the organization. The organization was really nice. It was very familial for a while. It then started building a relationship with an organization based in Philadelphia that was, we were a socialist organization. I'm a socialist, always have been. Sometimes I think maybe there's a form of capitalism that could possibly work, but it's hard to see. And so I felt very comfortable there for a couple of years. And then we started affiliating with an organization in Philadelphia. And I went right along with it. And I don't remember if the Philadelphia organization called itself Marxist-Leninist, but we did start studying the same stuff I had studied when I was in college. And at some point, I was assigned to go to Philadelphia. At this point, I had lost my job. My very brief marriage fell apart, and my father died, all within a matter of 2 months. I was kind of personally walking through life in a daze and went to Philadelphia, quit the organization, and then tried to figure out, okay, how am I going to rebuild my life? And I went to a National Lawyers Guild meeting in Philadelphia and met who became my best friend. And I met some of my people, and that was in the was not the 1980s. I got to protest the war in El Salvador, protests against, support the Sandinistas. I ended up going to Nicaragua. I did all that stuff while figuring out my life. I went into therapy for 4 years. I had put on a lot of weight in New Bedford, which was kind of the way that I used to manifest stress. And, I lost weight, and I started taking up bicycling and doing bike rides at the club and doing more bike riding, and figured out some issues about my father and men, and particularly about myself, feeling better about myself. And meanwhile, I was working in a law firm. It was a labor firm, but I was doing the general practice stuff. My clients were mostly union workers, and that was nice, but I didn't like the job. I was doing general practice. I just didn't find my niche in law. And I was thinking about changing careers, and I went to a career counselor who did some tests on me and said, what you really want to do is figure out your personal life before you figure out careers. So I went on a campaign to find a husband, which meant that I would just be introduce myself to men I didn't know. And I was on a bike ride on my birthday and met this guy who didn't look like my type because he was kind of skinny and looked clean. He had a beard, but it was very neatly trimmed. And he looked younger than me, and he was younger than me. long story short, we've been married for 37 years. And he was in Philadelphia temporarily doing research at Children's Hospital, but was doing a general surgery residency in Milwaukee. So we did a negotiation, which resulted in a decision to get married and get married and get pregnant and move to Milwaukee. And he finished his general surgery residency in Milwaukee. I did some very interesting work in Milwaukee. I worked for a guy that I had dated in law school who was a National Lawyers Guild adjacent person, and was like sort of a radical politician. And I did some work there. And then I worked in legal services and loved my work in legal services, doing Social Security disability representation, because it involved a lot of healthcare, diagnosing my patients, and then my clients. And then my husband got accepted into a pediatrics surgery fellowship, and it's a matching program. It was a very competitive matching program. He matched in Columbus. So all of a sudden we were moving to Columbus, Ohio. I left out that we spent 6 months in Oxford, England during that time. So move, make friends. We moved to Columbus, Ohio, my third move in 2 years. And he was there supposedly for 2 years to do a fellowship. And I worked with NARAL. I was a volunteer. I helped to file an amicus brief against some restrictive abortion law. And what else did I do? And Columbus is very different from Cleveland. Columbus was sort of organizationally challenged. Like if there was a protest, it was small. Milwaukee, we had big protests. I was used to big protests. And I couldn't find that in Columbus. Then my husband took a job here. So all of a sudden we were here. And so I was living here. I got a job in a lefty law firm, worked there for a year, went to a therapist to give myself permission to quit because I was miserable. I had my second child, who wanted me to spend more time with him. He was a baby who wanted me more than, anyway. So I quit. I started writing articles for the Columbus Free Press. The Columbus Free Press has been around for umpty-gumpty years. It is a lefty newspaper, and I started writing articles. I wrote an article about the need for universal health care. I met some people from Cleveland who are working on universal health care. They had a Northeast Ohio Coalition for Universal Health Care. And they also had just formed a national network of people working on universal health care from a variety of perspectives, single payer, other forms, but it was a national network. I met them. They were looking for somebody to work in Columbus like 16 hours a week following state policy, because after the Hillary Clinton plans fell apart, there was a widespread recognition among healthcare activists that, just like in Canada, national healthcare reform was going to happen state by state, and that we had to be building organizations state by state. This ended up in me meeting. I was good at my job. I loved it. I worked many hours for free. I ended up getting a grant to open a Columbus office, and then I ended up running the organization. We moved the organization to Columbus. I quadrupled the budget. We had a staff. We formed coalitions during the transition to Medicaid managed care, which is the privatization of healthcare, big time, and how to build the voice of consumers. We built a statewide consumer health advocacy organization to build the voice of consumers in healthcare. And that's the work I did until I retired in the end of 2015. So it's almost 10 years. And doing that work, we were challenging, I mean, the healthcare system, I like to call it the healthcare industrial complex. It is the essence of late stage capitalism with all its hierarchical models. I mean, during that time, we fought for a mid-level dental practitioner against the Dental Association, and we're fighting this hierarchy. And the AMA is the same way. I mean, they've just, got a grip on organized medicine that tends to be very hierarchical. So I've always, the part of me that held on to what I loved during that moment that I was involved in anarchism stayed a part of me, and that was always being vigilant about hierarchies. And when I was the executive director, I was the head of a hierarchy. So we brought in a consultant to work with us, we were interracial. So we brought in somebody to work on my racism and, the racism inside the organization. And that's part of that is breaking down hierarchy and figuring out how do you work in more collective ways. When we were building the voice of consumers in the new Medicaid, in the new models of care for people who are both on Medicaid and Medicare, these are people who are duly eligible. They may be disabled younger adults who want autonomy in their lives. They want to be making their own decisions. And it's very important to them, and they need the means to do so. That is very much about, building the voice of individuals and giving individuals the support of organized groups or collectives. We didn't call them collectives, but that's exactly what they were. We built regional consumer support groups and networks, to empower people and to encourage each other to stand up. So that gets us to, but something else was going on before that whole time, which is I grew up Jewish in a predominantly Jewish community, and my father quit the synagogue. My father grew up in a traditional synagogue in Brooklyn, quit a Reform synagogue before I was born. I grew up with no religion except Passover because it was the Feast of Freedom, and it meant a lot in my family. But I didn't know a whole lot I knew I was a very proud Jew. I was always a very proud Jew, culturally a Jew. This guy I met on a bike ride, turned out he grew up in a conservative Jewish household, and his sister was a Jewish educator married to a rabbi. So we ended up joining a conservative synagogue, and it turned out that the rabbi and the cantor were very committed to social justice, and they got involved. So I got drawn into synagogue life because there was a marriage of Judaism and social justice. So it made me want to study Judaism more. Also because I didn't like the fact that because I was a girl, my father didn't have me educated. Had I been a boy, I would have had a bar mitzvah and, gone through Hebrew school and everything. So, I began Jewish study. I had an adult bat mitzvah, but also in 1996, we were just starting our social justice group at the synagogue. The cantor who was in charge of it said, there's a new interfaith social justice group forming. we need 5 people to go to the covenanting convention. I said, I am way too busy. I mean, I have 2 little kids. I'm running this organization. I'm way too busy, but I'll go as a placeholder. I fell in love with the organization. Been involved in the organization ever since. It taught me a whole lot about organizing. And I'd never been good at organizing. So I've learned a lot about organizing. I'm a leader in the organization. The minute I retired, I was co-president for 3 years during COVID. I'm on the finance committee. I'm on the executive committee. I spend a lot of time on this organization. And it's, built on the Alinsky model of organizing. With Alinsky, they organized in unions. We organize in religious congregations because you've got a fixed group there the way you do in a labor organization. I've been, I've been trained. I organize in my congregation. I do negotiations with public officials. Our mission is to use our people power, the power of organized people, to hold public officials accountable to implement proven solutions to serious community problems. And we start by doing a listening process and hear what the problem. We vote on a problem, and then we research the problem and find a solution that's worked elsewhere, and we hold public officials accountable. So we're butting heads constantly with Democrats, and so I'm still there, and I'm also involved in some immigrant protection work, building up the immigrant response network, which is very weak in Columbus. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm too busy for a retired person. All week, because of you, I've been thinking about that. I don't know. If you called me a liberal and we were in the same room, I might hit you. I'd like to think of myself as progressive. If you ask me, am I a socialist? I'd say yes. But I don't belong to any socialist organizations, although I hang out with some democratic socialists. So I was, when the war in Gaza happened, I and some other people created a Central Ohio Jews for Justice group to just say that the organized Jewish community that stands with Israel doesn't speak for all Jews. And this group is a safe harbor for anti-Zionists and those of us who haven't completely given up on Zionism, but that's not the question. The question is, we think the occupation is horrible. We're totally opposed to the occupation, totally opposed to the war in Gaza. And so I hang out with democratic socialists in that and in the immigration work, and they're all like 40, 50 years younger than I am. 30 or 40 years younger than I am. So anyway, I don't have a label. I just know what labels I reject. Well, I think older adults like me have to really step aside for younger adults. I mean, you see that. That's one of the great failures of the Democratic Party. Well, the Democratic Party is pretty it's compromised in so many ways, but one of the ways is that they won't step aside for younger leadership. But that's really important, is to, and that happens in the whole, Jews are completely divided by the war in Gaza. And one of the fault lines is that the parents stand with Israel regardless, and the kids say, no, that's not my values. That's not the Jewish values you raised me on. So I see that replicating in a lot of contexts. What was your question?
Kind of the role of progressives in the contemporary world.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we be organizing. I'm sorry. Here's the real answer. I think it's really important that we be organizing people to stand up and fight for change. I think it's right now, I think these big demonstrations against Trump all over the country have to continue. I think they're very important. They're very important for saying, no, we haven't capitulated. The more people turn out, the more the numbers will grow. I mean, my first march on Washington, it was pitiful. It was like 50,000 or 25,000. You know, by 1970, there were 250,000 people in Washington. So I think it's very important that people stand up, that people, you know, work collectively, not capitulate to fear unless, you know, if they can possibly stand back. I think the work that we're doing locally in Bread is teaching people how to win. You know, people say, why aren't you going after the Ohio state government? They're awful. Well, we don't have the power to win against them. So we're not going to fight them until we have that power. But we do have the power to fight city and county officials, you know, to protect the interests of all the people of Columbus against real estate developers and the police. So I think, you know, learning to win local battles is important because you learn how to build movements. What else is important? Just to keep the faith. And I think it's important to speak out. I think we've got to figure out better ways to communicate with all the people who are victims of Trump and the Ohio government. I mean, when you think about the Medicaid cuts, the SNAP cuts, I mean, all the different cuts, the million cuts, the greatest shift in history of wealth through this tax, you know, the tax cuts for the rich. I try not to think about it too much. I try not to read about it too much. I don't want to know the gory details. But I think we've got to figure out a way to communicate. And unfortunately, certainly the Democratic Party doesn't know how to talk to people who are going to be hurt a lot by these policies. So we've got to learn to do it. I think it's important for people to know about the wobblies, to know about strands of anarchism and how they were healthy responses. They may not be the answer, but they're healthy responses to overly hierarchical organizations that lead to corruption. I mean, we've certainly seen corruption in labor unions, or else just union leaders identifying more with bosses than they do with their own members, and understanding anarchism, you know, which is more collective based, is important for informing what the models of social change need to look like.